historian of philosophy like me. So when we talk about negative theology, we usually connect this general philosophical view to later ancient Platonism, to authors such as Philo and Plotinus. This is, of course, true, but in a certain and much more generic sense, negative statements about gods, gods are as old as Greek philosophy. This view start with early Greek philosophy and with the criticism addressed by authors like Xenophanes through traditional religion, to the gods of Homer. As we all know, in some important passages of his lost work, Xenophanes sharply criticized the gods in Homer, and he sharply criticized the view that gods are similar to humans. So his criticism of any anthropomorphic account of gods leads Xenophanes to this view, that is that God, there is one God, which is in no way similar to human beings, either in body or in thought. It is an open question if Xenophanes is connected to Parmenides and to Parmenides' account of being. It is an open question. It's a very controversial issue. I am rather skeptical on this, but whatever this fact, certainly Xenophanes' criticism of the traditional religion leads him to a certain views about God, and Xenophanes' aim is to separate God from properties which apply to human or to, for example, horses, lions, and so on. This is, of course, a generic view which can lead to the view that we cannot say what God positively is. But of course, this generic criticism to the traditional religion is not connected to some precise ontological or metaphysical views, I would say. Well, in a certain sense, Plato follows this path when in the first part of the Republic, Book 2 and 3, when Plato sharply criticizes the gods of Homer and Hesiod, and he sharply criticized these gods because they behave like bad humans. They are cause of evils, they change themselves, and so on. When Socrates rejects the traditional gods in Homer, he says, for example, that God is simple and he doesn't change his own form. Well, of course, we can read Plato's account of ideas behind this statement, but it's not, after all, it's not necessary. What Plato says in this passage, what Socrates says in this passage, is that we shouldn't apply typically human features to God. We shouldn't conceive of God as humans in all of their controversial features. This is part of Plato's account of gods as different from human beings. But of course, if we move to the central books of the Republic, there we find a much deeper account of the principles of reality. And here we find an ontological or I deeply agree with the view that negative theology is, first of all, a metaphysical view, especially as far as ancient philosophy is concerned. Well, if we move to the central books of Plato's Republic, there we find a much deeper account of the principles of reality. And in this passage, which is at the very middle of Plato's Republic, book 6, page 509, Stephanus, we find the famous account of the idea of the good. The idea of the good, as Socrates says to Glaucon, is epeichena tes ousias, superior to being, presbeia kai dynami, in rank and power. And Glaucon, Socrates' interlocutor, answers, by Apollo, what the demonic superiority? Well, by Apollo may be an allusion to a Pythagorean illusion. Apollo as what has no multiplicity in himself, a privative and pola. What's the precise sense of Plato's description of the idea of the good as beyond being? As we shall see in a moment, late Neoplatonists, and from Plotinus onward, read this definition as entailing a complete transcendence of the idea of the good. So the idea of the good is beyond being, is completely transcendent vis-a-vis being, and what is even more important, transcends discursive knowledge, transcends all knowledge through discursive thinking. Does Plato really mean this in the Republic? It's very controversial. First of all, there is a whole tradition of thought according to which the idea of the good is a principle beyond ideas. But as a matter of fact, Plato regards the idea of the good as an idea, the highest idea, but one idea among other ideas, even if its rank is higher than the rank of other ideas. And secondly, Plato does not connect the idea of the good to complete transcendence. It simply connects the idea of the good to superiority in power and rank vis-a-vis the other ideas. It's very difficult to make sense of this, as is often the case. What Plato says in the Republics is very elliptic. Possibly, I'm rather convinced about this, Plato supplemented what we find in the Republic with his oral teaching in the Academy. Whatever of this, in this passage, we find a precise view concerning the structure of being, so to speak, according to which the highest rank is occupied by a principle which exceeds being and apparently exceeds multiplicity. This is a key passage for the later Platonist tradition. This passage has a key role in Plotinus' reading of Plato. The other key passage concerning Plato's the origins of negative theology in Plato is in Plato's Parmenides. In the second part of Plato's Parmenides, we find a very famous and enigmatic and cryptic discussion of a hypothesis concerning the one. The first hypothesis focuses on the one insofar as the one is only one. And insofar as the one is one and nothing else than the one in no way is. So no feature, no property can be ascribed to the one. Once again, certainly from Plotinus, possibly from some Platonist philosophers before Plotinus, this passage was taken as referring to a highest principle of reality, and this highest principle was regarded as being beyond knowledge, language, and being. We would like to know more about the status of the one in the second part of Plato's Parmenides. What is precisely the one in this dialogue? Once again, I must confess that I have no clear idea about this. Maybe Plato is referring to the unity of each single idea. Maybe Plato is referring to a principle beyond ideas, what in the unwritten doctrines, in the so-called unwritten doctrines is called the one, as the principle of unity in reality, as opposed to the dyad, principle of multiplicity and indetermination. So it may perhaps refer to the one as the principle of all beings. Possibly the one is something else. Possibly in this part of his dialogue, Plato is referring to unity vis-a-vis multiplicity in some kind of determination of being. Plato's Parmenides is enigmatic enough to originate very different readings. It's so, even if Plato can be seen as the origin of the idea that the principles of reality exceed human thinking and exceed human language, even if Plato can, of course, be seen as the origin of the general view, it is therefore very difficult to situate the precise origins of negative theology in Plato's works. And from this point of view, I think that, I think that Wolfson, in his monumental book on Philo, is right when he says that, of course, Plato's ideas are incorporeal, invisible and imperceptible, immovable, immutable, similarly of God, and so on and so on. But Plato does never really say that God is unknowable to us. And these views can be balanced with other passages in which Plato emphasizes that ideas and gods are perfectly knowable by us. As is often the case, Plato opens a field of research for subsequent philosophers. And as a matter of fact, the emphasis on the unknowability and unnameability of the first principle originated in the Platonist tradition after Plato. When exactly? Well, possibly in the academy. Some disciples of Plato, for example, his nephew Speusippus, possibly developed a metaphysical view according to which the principle of everything is unity beyond any determination or below any determination. But certainly, from a certain time onward, at least from the 1st century BC onward, we find in the Platonist tradition the tendency to unify Platonist and, so to speak, Pythagorean features and to develop a certain philosophical views concerning the hierarchy of being, which combine Plato and Pythagoras, or rather Philolaus, views about being. These are, of course, very obscure philosophers, such as Eudorus of Alexandria and Moderatus of Gades. They all live between the 1st century BC and the 2nd century AD. All of their works are lost, but we have some fragments through the later Neoplatonists, more precisely through Simplicius. For example, Simplicius, in a passage from his commentary on the Physics, ascribes to the Theodorus of Alexandria, the view that there is a principle of all beings, the principle of everything. This principle is superior to all oppositions which we find in reality. And from this principle, originates, from this principle are brought about 2 other and inferior principles. That is the second one, also called the monad, and a principle of multiplicity, so the dyad. So we have this hierarchy according to which there are 2 opposite principles of reality, the one and the dyad, and a supreme, a principle of everything, Uperano. This is the first one, which apparently exceeds all positive determinations of being. We have a number of treatises, what we call the Pseudo-Pythagorica. These are Pythagorean forgeries, and according to some scholars, I think they are right, at least some of these forgeries were composed in the environment of Eudorus of Alexandria. In one of these treatises, Pseudo-Archytas on Principles, we find this most interesting statement. What we call God is no cresson, superior to thought. And this is one of the earliest statements that the first principle is beyond thinking, is beyond nous. Of course, those treatises are written in a fake Doric because they were supposed to be written by Pythagorean philosophers. We find a rather similar view in Moderatus of Gades. This is a passage in Simplicius, drawn from Porphyry. Well, according to Moderatus, once again, we find a first one above being and all substance. Of course, this is, according to Dodds, one of the earliest, or maybe the earliest passage which confirms that Plato's Parmenides was read as a dialogue concerning the metaphysical principles. Of course, the idea that the first one is above being and all substance recalls both Plato's Parmenides, the first hypothesis of the second part, and Plato's Republic, the characterization of the idea of the good as epekena tes ousias. Note that the Plato's qualification, presbeia kai dunamei, in rank and power, is of course removed. Now the first principle is simply beyond all substance. We find a more or less similar hierarchy, a hierarchy of reality according to which at the top of reality there is something which exceeds being a substance, which possibly exceeds our thinking. Let's just think about Pseudo-Archytas on Principles. And this first principle has to be grasped in a different way, has to be grasped in a way which, so to speak, removes all limits pertaining to our human thinking and language. This background, note that Eudorus comes from Alexandria. The Pythagorean forgeries were probably prepared in Alexandria, and of course, Philo Philo develops is theological and philosophical thought in Alexandria. In Philo of Alexandria, we find a number of passages which clearly emphasize that God, of course, Philo's God is not the one of the Pythagoreans. It's the God of the Jewish tradition, but Philo makes extensive use of Platonist and Pythagorean categories in order to make sense of his theological views. Here we find a programmatic passage from the Opificio Mundi where Philo calls the activating cause. It is a Stoic vocabulary, of course, but the focus of this passage is not Stoic at all, is Platonist and Pythagorean, is the absolutely pure and unadulterated intellect of the universe, superior to excellence and superior to knowledge, and even superior to the good and the beautiful itself. This is one of the earliest passages in which we find something like a negative account of God. Another famous passages from Philo's on Dreams says that God, for whom no name, nor utterance, nor conception of any sort is adequate. All of these passages point to a precise view about God, a view which emphasizes that God is in itself superior to language and thinking. Note that according to these passages, think, for example, of the second passage, God is in itself superior to language and thinking. It is not the case that, for example, there is a name of God and we are not aware of this name, but there is no possible name which is adequate to the nature of God. Or at least this is what those passages seem to convey. And certainly Philo the Pythagorean. Philo is very often refers to Pythagorean views. For example, here we find a quotation from Philolaus in his De Opificio Mundi, and well, in these passages, of course, Philo quotes Philolaus and quotes his view about the first principles. Philo's philosophical background is certainly very similar to the philosophical background in Eudorus Moderatus or in the pseudo-Pythagorean treatises. That said, there are several open issues in Philo's works, and scholars deeply diverge about Philo's own contribution to the history of philosophy and theology. Here we have some examples. In his famous book about Philo, Wolfson was certainly aware of the parallel between the pseudo-Pythagorean treatises and Philo, but Wolfson's conclusion was very strong. According to Wolfson, those writings were formed under the influence of Philo. So it was Philo who first developed these views, and these views were subsequently developed by the authors of the Pythagorean forgeries. This is, of course, a rather implausible view, and subsequent scholars have changed this picture. One of the most important scholars in this area of research, Eric Robertson Doss, in his famous article on the Parmenides of Plato, has a very poor opinion about Philo. Basically, he says that Philo is a most confusing author with contradictory views about gods, and his eclecticism is rather far removed from genuine philosophy. Well, this is a very radical and disparaging view. I would quote another example, John Whittaker's articles about Neo-Pythagoreanism and the transcendent absolute, and I think that Whittaker pointed in the right direction. There are some very significant parallels concerning the first principle and what we call negative theology in Philo and in other contemporary writings, for example, the Hermetic writers, and probably all of these passages point to some common sources. Actually, I think that, for example, Eudorus of Alexandria and Platonism in Alexandria is the main source for Philo's philosophical views. Possibly some metaphysical interpretation of Plato's Parmenides was developed in that environment. Certainly, in that environment, we find the view that the first principle is beyond language and thinking. Can we make sense of Philo's contradictory statements about God? In certain passages, Philo suggests that God is beyond any possible name. In other passages, Philo rather suggests that we are not aware of the genuine name of God. Further passages suggest that God is knowable through God's powers, and the status of powers of God in Philo's theology is a most difficult issue. Can we make sense of this? Well, according to Doss, all these reveal some deep confusion. Here I have another passage from Francesca Calabi. Calabi suggests something different. I'm not a specialist of Hebrew theology at all, but Calabi suggests that this tension in Philo's account of God can, in a sense, be explained through different sources in his philosophy. So, as Calabi says, the question I'm asking is, does God not have a name at all, or does it just not reveal it? We find both positions in Philo. And according to Calabi, this position point to different origins. The idea that God does not reveal his name to us may perhaps derive from the Jewish prohibition on pronouncing the name of God, whereas the idea that there is no name at all adequate to God possibly depends, probably I would say depends on Philo's Platonist and Pythagorean background. It seems to me a rather plausible solution. I think we have to be aware that it's very difficult to extract a completely consistent system, theological system from Philo, but it seems to me that Dodd's statement that Philo is just confused does not really explain what we find in Philo's works. Well, my paper moves then to the third and final part, that is Plotinus. For the historian of philosophy, Plotinus raises several questions. On the one hand, Plotinus is deeply aware of the philosophical debates around him. Plotinus would not exist without the Platonist debates of his times. On the other hand, Plotinus develops a highly original version of those Platonist debates. The great Père Henri-Dominique Saffray, who has just passed away, by the way, said that Plotinus is an island, un île, dans le courant de la tradition platonicienne. So it's some kind of isolated figure in the current of Platonic tradition. I think it's partly true, at least. So we find a lot of parallel between Plotinus and other Platonist philosophers before him, but those parallels point to Plotinus' highly original reading of those traditional issues. In order to make sense of what we call negative theology in Plotinus, I think we have to be aware of some features of Plotinus' metaphysics. So once again, I completely agree that in order to make sense of negative theology, we have to be aware of some deep metaphysical assumptions. And according to Plotinus, the first principle of everything, which is not the intellect, which is not being, but which is the one, the first principle of everything is the first principle precisely because the first principle is none of the beings which are brought about. So the first principle is the principles of all beings, but the first principle can be the principle of all beings precisely because the first principle is nothing of the things which it produces. And we find, for example, this view in the first sentence of Plotinus' Treatise 6.9. All beings are beings due to unity or due to the one. Basically, what Plotinus says in this passage that all things which are beings in virtue of a principle which is not being in itself. And as Plotinus says in the other passages from Treatise 6.7, this principle is not an intellect, is not being, it is the cause of intellect and being, but it is the cause of all of these things precisely because it is none of these things. Note that Plotinus shares with Plato a basic assumption according to which thinking entails multiplicity. We have thinking where we have some kind of multiplicity. And because the first principle is beyond multiplicity, the first principle is beyond thinking as well. And this is one of the key theses in Plotinus' philosophy. So in Plotinus, there is no ambiguity at all. as we said before in Philo, but also in other Platonist philosophers before Plotinus, we find a certain kind of ambiguity. Is the first principle beyond intellect, or is the first principle the first intellect? Sometimes the same author has both views. Well, in Plotinus, we have no ambiguity at all. The intellect is the second principle. Intellect and being derived from the one which is the principle of all things, dunamis panton, is beyond being and beyond intellect. Of course, this view is strictly connected to Plotinus' approach to what we call negative theology, precisely because we cannot grasp the one positively through positive categories of beings. And this is not an accidental feature. It's not the case that we are too weak to grasp the one through our thought, but someone else, a superior being, could do this. The thing is that the one cannot simply be grasped through thinking, and the one doesn't think about itself. It is beyond thinking and beyond being in its own nature. The one is so beyond knowledge and beyond language, as Plotinus says, for example, in this passage from his treatise 49. The one is without the something, as Plotinus says elsewhere. The one is no genus. In order to be a genius, the one should be determined in some way, but the one has no determination at all. It is the power of everything, but it transcends all things and it transcends the intellect. That's why we cannot properly speak about the one. In a certain sense, the one exceeds all possible name. Well, this is, of course, a very consistent and radical statement about the nature of the first principle. And it is, of course, very difficult to be, so to speak, loyal to this view. Plotinus, for example, sometimes says that the one is a cause. He says that the one is the cause of life. Life is a feature of being, of the intelligible being. The one is beyond life, and it is the cause of life. But at the same time, the one is not a cause, as Plotinus says in Treatise 6.9. When we say that the one is a cause, we do not predicate an accident of it, but of ourselves, because we grasp something of it. So in those passages, we can say that Plotinus, of course, cannot always follow his idea that we shouldn't predicate anything about the one. It is beyond knowledge. It is beyond language, and the fact that the one is beyond knowledge and language is rooted in the metaphysical status of the one, which exceeds all multiplicity and therefore exceeds all possible reality. So how can we ascend to the one? If there is a principle like this, how can we grasp this principle? Is it possible to grasp this principle after all? According to Plotinus, it is perfectly possible to grasp the one. At least it is possible for those who undertake a very difficult path through philosophy, but it is possible to grasp the one for the simple reason that the one is, so to speak, in each of us. So, as Plotinus says in this famous passage at the end of his treatise number 10, 5.1, chapter 12, according to Plotinus, all the principles of reality are in ourselves. And in order to grasp the principle, we have to remove what? You have to remove all the sounds which connect ourselves to the sensible realm. By doing this, we make free us from sensible features, and we are ready to grab the higher principles, and we are also ready to grasp the one. There is a certain debate among scholars about the limits of this grasp. I would not like to go into this debate. I think that some passages from Plotinus are underdetermined, so it's not completely clear whether we can, so to speak, remove completely our limits and grasp the one as it is, or if these limits remain, so to speak, even if we are able to grasp in some sort the one. I think that Plotinus passages do not always help to settle this issue. But I think it's very important that we focus on negation in this process. Negation in Plotinus is something which is close to abstraction. The famous chapter 17 from Treatise 5.3, in this chapter, Plotinus says, how can this come about? So how can we grasp the first principle, aphelepanta, abstract from everything? The verb is aphaireo, remove. And I think that Whitaker has clearly explained that aphiresis in Plotinus is something, of course, it is a kind of negation. From Alcinous onward, negation and abstraction are connected. But we shouldn't think of negative, of this removal as a merely negative process. Negative theology has, so to speak, a positive side, according to which, by removing all the features pertaining first to sensible beings, and then to soul, then to thinking and language, by removing everything, something remains, and what remains is the very first principles of all things. That's why I think that Whitaker and Wolfson are perfectly right when they emphasize that Plotinus' keywords are not an apophase, but an aphirese. So in the removal of everything, what remains is the first principle of everything. This is, in a sense, Plotinus' mystic view, mystical view. Is Plotinus a mysticism? What kind of mysticism do we find in Plotinus? Once again, it is a rather open question, but what is important, in my view, is that the process of negation in Plotinus is clearly connected with the process of removal and of discovery of something more fundamental, so to speak. And this ground of everything is the ground of everything, but is also somehow in ourselves. That's why we can make sense of the process of removal and abstraction. And I have this, in my view, wonderful passage from Dodd's article on the Parmenides of Plato, when he talks about the conundrums of Neo-Pythagoreans metaphysical systems. He says, these tedious accumulations of negatives may content the metaphysician, but as Einstein says somewhere, one can't worship the alpha privative. I think that, as always, Dodd captures a key feature in Plotinus' approach to negative theology. The negative theology is actually the removal of something superficial and the discovery of something more fundamental. And the ground of everything, according to Plotinus, is beyond all limits, all limited determination. It is beyond Aristotle's categories. It is beyond Plato's genera. It is not a genus, but it is at the same time the ground of everything. Everything originates from this first principle, which is in ourselves, as said before. That's why when describing Plotinus' approach, Dodds, in his book Pagan and Christian in the Age of Anxiety, says that Plotinus mysticism, as its natural root, is a kind of rationalist and mystical philosophy, and its root is the potential identity of the soul, which is divine ground, and the general law that all things tend to revert to their source. It is the actualization of something which was only waiting to be realized. I think it's an excellent characterization of Plotinus' approach, the momentary revelation of an eternal datum. What is important, my paper ends with Plotinus, but it's maybe important that later Platonists after Plotinus, people like Iamblichus or Proclus, do not share this general view. Whereas Plotinus is in a sense deeply convinced that we find in our own nature all the principles of reality, later Neoplatonists, later pagan Neoplatonists, such as Iamblichus or Proclus, emphasize that there is a deep separation between our condition here below and the highest principles. That's why the later Neoplatonists emphasize the importance of the oracles, of the Chaldean oracles, in order to ascend, to revert to gods. Whereas the Chaldean oracles have nothing, have no role at all in Plotinus' philosophy. So I would like to finish my paper by emphasizing that negative theology is, in a sense, an extremely fruitful approach, both for the history of religion and for the history of philosophy. Plotinus can, in a sense, be seen as the first very coherent representative of this approach, but at the same time, his philosophical views was not completely shared even by those who we call Neoplatonists, even by Platonist philosophers after Plotinus. So I will end my paper with this remark, and thank you very much for your attention.